thank you for being here today. It is now my pleasure to introduce our main speaker, Margaret Huang. Ms. Huang is an internationally renowned advocate for human rights and racial justice. And she is now the new president and CEO of the Southern Poverty Law Center and its Action Fund. She's a native of Tennessee and received a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia and a BS degree in foreign service from Georgetown. Prior to Southern Poverty Law Center, Ms. Huang serves as the executive director of Amnesty International USA, where she was in charge of leading campaigns to protect the human rights of migrants, refugees, torture survivors, gun violence victims, as well as activists and protesters across the globe. Please welcome Margaret Huang.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's such a great pleasure to join all of you this evening. And I love taking part in Asian American community activities. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of your event this evening. I wanted to share a little bit about me before I get into the substance of my remarks, because people often ask how I landed at the Southern Poverty Law Center. I'm the daughter of a Chinese immigrant to the United States and a white woman whose family has been in the country for many generations. I grew up in a small town in East Tennessee, which is pretty unusual. And it is because of my parents' commitment to connect me to my Chinese family in Taiwan and in China later that I was able to travel several times to Asia and then eventually to other parts of the world. These experiences opened my eyes to oppression and injustice in many places. But perhaps the most important experience was when I recognized those problems here in my own country. Today, I have the privilege to speak to you as the leader of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is one of the largest civil rights organizations in the country. The SPLC will celebrate our 50th anniversary next year. 5 decades of confronting white supremacy and demanding justice for those whose rights have been violated. I'm very grateful to be in this role at this particular moment and to be helping to shape social justice work that recognizes our diversity as a country as one of our greatest strengths. We need this diverse movement for social justice more than ever because we're at a pivotal moment in our nation's history. In the last several years, we've witnessed injustices against Black and brown men and women who have been harassed, beaten and tortured, and killed by the police. We have been shocked and horrified when white nationalists became mass murderers, shooting African Americans, Jews, Muslims, and Latinx communities. We've watched elected officials deny the humanity of communities of color by trying to eliminate access to healthcare during a global pandemic. We're seeing the growing demand for food and shelter from an increasingly vulnerable population of poor people suffering as COVID continues its strain on our communities. We can no longer ignore the long-standing discrimination, the institutional and structural racism against Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. Today, as the Asian American community, we have to join our brothers and sisters across racial identities to demand that every person in this country be able to exercise their human rights. I wanted to express my appreciation to the board of directors for the Asian American Alliance of Marin for adopting a solidarity statement and a call to action in September. Statements like these are critical for building our intersectional movement for social justice, and I thank you. Now we have a new moment for action. I believe that the incoming Biden administration, and yes, I am accepting it even though nobody else is for some reason, the Biden administration is going to offer us the opportunities to demand new policies and to stop harmful practices. I thought I would share with you tonight some of the most urgent actions that we need this new administration to take for our Asian American community and also for all other communities of color, Indigenous communities, Black communities in this country. The first urgent action that we need is an end to the ever-increasing use of detention, both for criminal actions as well as for immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. You all are in California, so you are likely familiar with many of the policies that the Trump administration has adopted to harass, detain, and deport immigrants, many of whom have credible claims to legal status in this country. These policies have been used particularly to target the Latinx community, who often receives the most attention from both the media and immigration enforcement agencies. But it's worth noting that the overwhelming majority of the Asian American Pacific Islander community are immigrants or children of immigrants. We have the highest proportion of immigrants of any racial or ethnic group in the United States. Approximately 2/3 of Asian Americans were born outside of the US, and more immigrants enter the US from Asia than any other region of the world. Because President Trump has focused his policies on enforcement and detention, they have greatly impacted many in our community. From 2017 to 2018 alone, the Cambodian American refugee community suffered a 279% increase in deportations. The number of migrants from India apprehended at the southern border tripled from 2017 to 2018 to nearly 9,000 people. Arrests of immigrants from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia alone constituted nearly 3,000 arrests, about 20% of the total number of Asian immigrants who were arrested during that 2-year period. These arrests have led to thousands of our community living in fear of deportation. It's also worth noting that the Southeast Asian American community has been particularly targeted by immigration and customs enforcement operations. Many young people in this community who might have made a mistake in their youth and received a minor conviction are now facing exile from the only country they've ever known. Many in the Southeast Asian community arrived as refugees, and they have struggled facing economic insecurity and over-policing in their communities. Southeast Asian immigrants are 3 to 4 times more likely to be deported for old criminal convictions compared to any other immigrant group. But the experience of Asian Americans is just one part of a larger immigrant detention system in the US. In 2019, more than 500,000 people were held in immigrant detention, averaging more than 50,000 on any given day. That is an extraordinary number. But now consider how many people were incarcerated in prisons in the United States in the same year. In 2019, 1.435 million people were held in jails and prisons. That means that nearly 2 million people were being detained in the United States in 2019, most of whom were Black and brown. What is the urgent change we are seeking? We have to reject the use of incarceration and detention as answers to bad immigration policies or to problems like drug abuse and economic despair. We as a society have to find a better response to these challenges. Until then, our communities of color will be disproportionately affected and imprisoned. A second policy issue that must be addressed urgently is poverty. The United States is the wealthiest country in the world, controlling almost 30% of the entire world's wealth. The resources of this country are astonishing, but we also have the highest rates of poverty amongst all of the industrialized countries. In 2019, more than 10% of Americans were living in poverty. And if we look at the year 2018, the rates were higher for women than for men. Women were nearly 13% of all women and more than 10% of all men, and even higher for children at more than 16% of the child population in the country. When you break it down by race, the poverty rate for indigenous communities in the US was more than 25%, and more than 20% for African Americans. The data on Asian Americans is unusual because the Asian American population is so diverse. A recent Pew study determined that income inequality in the United States is greatest amongst Asians, even more than whites. While there are many successful and wealthy Asians, Asian communities vary significantly in economic status, tenure in the United States, and of course, education levels, which results in this wide disparity in income levels. In 2018, 12.3% of Asian Americans were below the federal poverty line. And this ranged from nearly 7% of Filipino Americans to nearly 40% of Burmese Americans. It's a tragedy to find so much poverty in such a wealthy country. Poverty, as I'm sure you all know, is linked to so many social ills in our communities: substandard housing and homelessness, inadequate nutrition and food insecurity, lack of access to health care and the resurgence of preventable diseases and other health problems, unsafe neighborhoods, and under-resourced schools. The impact of these realities is substantial, ranging from affecting unemployment rates to abuse and neglect in the home, to behavioral and mental health challenges, to drug and alcohol addictions, and of course to violence. One would expect the United States to prioritize responding to this crisis. After all, child poverty costs more than $1 trillion a year in lost economic productivity and increased health costs. We have to demand that the Biden administration prioritize a response to poverty that uplifts economic justice for all people. And this demand is even more important in light of the COVID pandemic. The pandemic, as of the latest statistics this week, has infected more than 9.5 million Americans. And the death rate is now more than 235,000. The signs from this last week are even more discouraging. We've had 2 days where more than 100,000 new infections were documented this week, each day. Because we're still early in the life of COVID-19, there is a lack of accurate disaggregated data on the infections of Asian Americans. Typically, the aggregate death rate for Asian Americans from COVID is similar to that of white Americans. But what's noteworthy is that there are significant disparities at the subgroup level. So for example, Pacific Islanders are 2 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with the virus than whites. In San Francisco, Asian Americans account for 13.7% of the cases, but 52% of the deaths. And in Nevada, Asian Americans are dying at more than twice the rate of white Americans. But frankly, what's been most concerning about COVID is that Asian Americans have become the target of a unique rise in racist rhetoric and discrimination since the beginning of the outbreak. Researchers have documented at least 1,900 hate incidents across 46 states. And a third of Americans report witnessing other individuals blaming Asians for the pandemic. This blame contributes to the existing stresses of coping with the virus. And many people have raised concerns about the growing mental health problems in the Asian American community. There is a nonprofit group called Crisis Text Line, which provides free mental health support by text message. And they reported seeing a nearly 40% increase in texts from the Asian American community in just the first quarter of 2020. It's important to see that the inaccurate stigmatization of Asian communities might even discourage some of our community members from seeking care when they're sick, because they don't want to feed the narrative that they're part of the problem. Of course, the COVID pandemic has also revealed terrible disparities for Black and Indigenous communities. We've seen that in terms of access to healthcare, in health outcomes for those infected, and in food and job security. There have been multiple studies showing that people of color are experiencing a much greater disproportionate number of cases and deaths. We have to figure out, how do we respond to this global pandemic in ways that bring our communities together and ensure that no community is left behind or being treated unfairly? One last issue I'd like to raise with all of you is the issue of voting rights, which has certainly been at the forefront of all of our minds this past week. While Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders started arriving in this hemisphere back in the 16th century, we are now seeing millions more come in today as new immigrants. The Pew Center reported that Asian Americans are the only racial ethnic group where naturalized citizens, rather than those born in the United States, are the majority of eligible voters. But we have a lot of barriers to our civic participation: a lack of civic education, a lack of access to in-language materials, and of course, increasing efforts to suppress the electoral participation of voters of color. Sadly, Asian American voter turnout has been historically low. We have seen gains since 2014, when the Asian American voter turnout was only 28% nationwide. By 2018, this turnout had grown significantly to 42%, which is a fantastic increase, but still we're significantly lower than the turnout rates for whites and Blacks, both of which are over 50%. And the barriers to electoral participation are growing. In 2013, the Supreme Court issued a decision in Shelby County versus Holder that removed the protections from the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prevented voter suppression laws from being enacted. Since that decision in 2013, we have seen many state governments adopt voter suppression laws that do things like require photo ID to vote, deny language access at the polls, require an exact match of your photo ID to your ballot signature in order to count the vote, poll closures in communities of color, gerrymandering of districts, and of course, my favorite, the purging of voter lists. Let me share just a couple of these in greater detail. In 2016, 3 years after the Shelby versus Holder decision, there were 868 fewer polling places across the country. 868 polling places were closed, the majority of which were in minority and poor neighborhoods in the South. We also know that people who are young, poor, students, and minorities may not vote in every election. So some secretaries of state have required that voters have to vote in every election to stay on the voter rolls. It's called the use it or lose it privilege. If voters don't participate in a local election or an off-year ballot, they can be purged off the rolls. And to give you a sense of how powerful this tool has been, between the years 2014 and 2016, close to 16 million Americans were purged from voting rolls across the country. To give you an idea of how significant these actions were in a state context, in Georgia, my neighbor here in Alabama, the current Republican governor, Brian Kemp, was the acting Secretary of State for the last election in 2018. He purged approximately 340,000 voters from the state's registration rolls while he was the acting Secretary of State. That is close to 11% of all the voters in the voting rolls of Georgia. He won his election to the governorship by just over 50,000 votes. If Asian Americans want to have a voice in our democracy, we have to fight for the rights of all Americans to vote and to count every vote if we want to stop the suppression of our democratic processes. As we start to prepare now for a new administration to take office, there are going to be many urgent proposals that will need attention and consideration by both the White House and Congress, and of course, by our state governments. I hope that all of you will take the time to contact your members of Congress and your state legislators and urge them that these challenges be addressed. The detention of immigrants, refugees, and so many others must stop. We have to tackle poverty and food insecurity, particularly now with the COVID pandemic in place. We have to work across racial and ethnic lines to ensure that all communities are protected during this pandemic. And we must preserve our democracy. These have to be the top priorities of our elected officials moving forward. I am so very proud to be part of our Asian American community and very grateful to all of you for inviting me tonight. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Yes, I can send you my presentation in writing. And it is being recorded, so you've got that. Are there any questions?
Are we unmuted now?
You are, please.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you. That was a beautiful speech. I really liked the way you presented the facts and the data. That's really important. Anyway.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate it.
Margaret, what would be your explanation for why voter turnout is so low in the Asian community compared to other groups?
It's a great question, Barry. Thank you for asking it. I think for many in our community, because so many of us are immigrants or are children of immigrants, we may not necessarily have the tradition of voting, depending on where we come from. It just may not have been part of our experience. And so the question of thinking of voting as not only a privilege or a right, but a responsibility and something that is important for our community at the larger level, I think that's something that Asian Americans are now stepping into, but hadn't been doing that in the past. And you saw that huge growth in Asian American voter turnout in just those 4 years. I expect you're going to see another significant bump this year. I think you'll see some sizable growth again in the number of Asian Americans voting. But one of our biggest challenges is language access. if we're not being able to access information about candidates, about how to vote, about where to vote, that can be a tremendous challenge. And outside of California, I'm not sure, and maybe New York, I'm not sure how much effective outreach in languages that are spoken by our community is available.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. But you know, I'm Asian. I'm from the Philippines. And I'm actually very surprised what you said about the poverty level for Asian Americans or immigrants, and all the problems that you have mentioned about the Asian Americans. I listen to the news and try to keep myself abreast of everything that's going on. And I am still very surprised about that. And I think part of me is saying we're not being represented enough in the news community for people like myself who keep myself abreast about what's going on inside the United States or outside of this country, for me to be surprised about that. Am I making myself clear?
Yeah, no,
Or
it's a great point. You know, I think it's both one of the advantages and clearly a huge disadvantage of our current media system. The mainstream media is very much trying to respond what they think people are most interested in, and that's frequently not in-depth understanding of how different communities are affected by problems. And then the advantage we have is that there are so many avenues for learning the news, but then you have to be very careful about learning what is real news, what is true news, and what is not. And so it does create challenges about how you search for information about our community or any other, because you might be finding resources that are not as carefully researched and analyzed as others. But the information is out there, and it's one of our responsibilities to be an informed electorate, that we learn about how these different problems are affecting us. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about the Asian American experience in each of those problems, because we are very much affected by each of those problems.
I have
This is
a question.
Jim.
May I
I'm
ask
sorry.
a question?
Please, Jean.
I have been very worried that Trump would call the Chinese virus, but also the attitude towards trade and negotiation with China. And also, I think Biden kind of take up the anti-China attitude. So I wonder if you are concerned about that, because if it's anti-China, then the Asian American usually suffer in this country. I would like your opinion on this and what we can do.
Thank you. I think that's a great question. I certainly don't think that Biden is as bad as Trump has been on publicly rejecting China and making these really irresponsible claims about the Chinese virus. I also don't know that Joe Biden has ever been particularly good on US-China relations. So you're right to have questions. I think what's going to matter the most is whom he appoints to key positions in his cabinet. So we have to be paying attention to whom he appoints as Secretary of State and whom he appoints as Secretary of Defense, as well as the people he puts in charge of national security at the White House. And this is a place where you as voters can weigh in. When you find out whom he has appointed to those positions, you should call your elected representatives in Congress and tell them, first, if you support the person, and second, that they need to be asking questions about the US-China relationship in the confirmation hearings. That's a great way to get them on the record, talking about what they would do to improve the relationship and how they would make amends for some of the damage that's been done over the last few years.
That sounds really good. Thank you.
So Margaret,
Margaret, my
can
name
I
is
ask a
Jim.
question?
Yeah, I want to say something again. Thank you, Margaret. And I want to touch on what you say. And I think we all realize Asian Americans is still a very broad category. So I'm glad that in some of your talk, you broke down and said Southeast Asians or the Cambodians or the Laotians. And I think like what you were saying of how we have to reach across to our Black and Brown brothers and sisters and other communities, we have to likewise within our own Asian American community to reach out. We're very grateful to have Ben Liu, working with the Vietnamese population here in Marin. But I think that either some further breakdowns of some of the things that you said. I know the poverty and the food insecurity issue. I think about a year or so ago, I attended some food insecurity forum here in Marin and was pretty shocked to hear that food insecurity was also problematic among the Asian Americans here in Marin. So I think that that was a good way to just let us know we are not the model minority. And I think that sometimes living in Marin, because of the stereotype of Marin is a wealthy, affluent community with a lot of professionals and educated people, that we do have the pockets, but we do have the immigrants. And what I see as a kind of an inspiration is seeing how there is the next generation of Asian Americans stepping up into politics. Somebody recently asked me who I would recommend for City College Board of Trustees in San Francisco, and I not in San Francisco anymore, but I used to work for City College, and I looked up who was running, and I was so amazed that two young, I think they're Chinese Americans that immigrated from Taiwan. Their parents went to City, they went to City, and they're stepping up. And I think that with Asian Americans from all the different categories stepping up into politics and leadership roles will also inspire their immigrant families and relatives to go and vote. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. I'm sorry, I know there are a few other questions. Is it helpful, Emily, to ask people to put them into the chat just so we know what they are and I can call on people to read them?
Do people know how to put your comments or question into the chat? Because I'm concerned also, maybe some people don't know how to do that. But we are, so Margaret, here's our question to you. We did say that we will try to cut it shorter so that you could, because you're a different time zone. Would you be willing to take a couple more questions?
Sure, no, I'm happy to, yeah.
And so if people have questions, can we maybe take 2 more questions, and please try to make it not too long? We have 2 questions with the raised hand.
Thank you, Kay. I know you had an earlier one too.
Yeah.
So can I read both of yours? Great.
Yes, I've been a longtime supporter of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is why I wanted to come on tonight. And I'm wondering, as the new leader, is the mission still to track hate groups in America?
It is absolutely still one of our major focus areas in the organization. You probably know, because you've been a supporter for so long, that the Southern Poverty Law Center does litigation on a number of issues, including several of the ones I talked about tonight. But there's no question that monitoring hate groups, tracking hate groups, is still a major focal area for us. I'll share with you, we're planning some changes in the annual hate count that we do. One of the criticisms that we've received for the hate count is that we count the number of total groups across the country who have embraced an extremist ideology, but we haven't made distinctions for how they then promulgate that ideology. And so one of the things we want to do in this year's report is we'll actually talk about the hate groups that promote policies that are hateful toward different groups versus the hate groups who are going into the street and trying to foment violence. They're all hate groups, we're not taking them off, but we do want to make a distinction so that people can then start to think about the ways you respond to different groups. Some groups, you have to counter their policies and you have to call out what they're trying to do with legislatures and that sort of thing. other groups, you're probably calling the FBI and the police because you're worried about the violence that they could create. So we want to try to do that so that we can then make more active recommendations to policymakers, to communities on how to respond to problems.
Yeah, I think that's important, and I think it's also important with this changing atmosphere that we've had to look at this in relation to police departments and policing.
Yeah, there's no question. Okay, thank you for that. I see a question from Henry about bringing together diverse Asians. Henry, where are you?
Yeah, right here.
Hi.
Hi.
Do you want to say anything else about your question?
No.
Okay. I think one of the most, oh, I'm sorry, Henry, you muted yourself, so I missed that. Can you say it again?
Especially the Southeast Asians, getting the Cambodian, the Vietnamese, the other groups that normally are not involved with us Asian groups.
Well, and I'll just note, South Asians are another entire community that often don't join in the same Asian American groups that I have been part of. So you're absolutely right. Southeast Asians, East Asians, South Asians, they're all very diverse. And then of course, within those groups, there are often long-time historical enmities between the different nationalities. So it does make it tough. What I'll tell you though is that the work that the Asian American community is doing to unify across these differences, these language differences, these cultural differences, is very much a model for how the broader social justice movement has to do the same. Just as it can be difficult for Vietnamese Americans and Japanese Americans and Indian Americans to find ways to work together and unify, those are the same challenges we have with the Central Americans and the Central, the folks from Central America, the folks from Mexico, the folks from the Middle East and from Africa. All of us need to find ways to work together. And then of course, there are the indigenous people of this country who were here before any of us arrived. So there's no easy answers. It takes trust building. It takes support for one another's agendas. We can't ask people to support us if we're not willing to turn out and support them. So we have to find ways to do this work together. And this is long time work. This is not, you come to our protest and we'll come to yours and now we're good friends. This is over years. We join together, we share food, as Emily pointed out, and we do the work that needs to be done together to make the policy changes that we need.
Hi, Henry. It's Vin Lu here. Can I respond to your question as well? I know that your question has been asked many times attending this kind of conference. Most people say that Southeast Asian is not very involved with other Asian groups like Japanese, American, Korean. The reason being, first, I think as a first generation myself from Vietnam, we've been here 45 years old. Most of our time of fighting to survive when we come to this country. But now I have seen my second generation, they're really involved. If you look through other young generation activity, they are there. Even though we're in the Southern California, got so many of them even on the public official, elected official position, because I think they are involved. But unfortunately, because the first generation, I can tell the reason why, because there's so much for them to survive and raise the family and to adjust to a new society, new lifestyle. Fortunately, I work in the social field, so I am here. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. I just tell you the truth. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Emily, may I take a couple more questions? I'm also conscious I'm eating into your time as well.
Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat box. So maybe if you would maybe take a scan and say, maybe answer 2 questions. I think you think that could cover maybe, double dip, but thank you.
Sure. So let me say this on a possible API presidential appointee. We have one. She's Kamala Harris. She's ours. We have to claim her. So all of you should be thinking about how we lift up her voice, how we support her efforts in the administration. She's ours. I'm thrilled that she represents us as well as many others. And I think that gives us a great opportunity to really build the presence of the Asian American community in the White House and beyond. Yay, good for us. Thoughts on affirmative action, fascinating. That's like a whole other talk. So maybe we can put that on the agenda for the next one. But I would just say, I believe in affirmative action. I believe, frankly, in going further than affirmative action. I think we have to make reparations for our history. And I think that's more than just giving people opportunity. I think it's recognizing that we've created an unfair playing field for so many. And until we address that structural problem of disadvantage and discrimination, we're not going to be able to see affirmative action achieve what it ultimately is trying to do. And in terms of what can your organization and your collective work do, there's so much that you all can do. And I'm just so thrilled to see how active you are and the voice that you've taken collectively on the importance of racial justice at this moment. I think it's going to be really important that organizations like yours reach out to other groups like Black Lives Matter, like the Latino organizations, like the indigenous communities, and ask what you can do to support their agenda. Because you're going to find you have very similar and shared agendas. And the way that we all win is when we work together to make those happen. So please keep up your activism, keep up your great spirits. Thank you all so much for inviting me this evening. And I wish you all the best in your next steps.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And you're welcome to stay with us for as long as you want. Even if you want to join us for a breakout room, that'd be awesome too. So, but we don't want to keep you up too late.
Thanks so much. I actually have another meeting, believe it or not. So I'm going to jump off and go to my next meeting. But it was great to be with you all. Thanks so much.